The dust of the long road had settled into the very weave of her dress, a second skin of grit and exhaustion. Elara Hale stood on the bottom step of the porch, her small son, Thomas, clutching her skirt. His face was a pale oval in the harsh afternoon light, his eyes wide as he stared at the man who filled the doorway. The man was bigger than she had imagined from his letters, broad in the shoulder, with a face carved from the same hard land that stretched out behind him. This was Silas Croft, rancher, widower, a man in need of a wife, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. This was the moment he would see the truth of her and send her away. She had decided on the stagecoach ride over that she would not let him invite her in. She would not let him offer her a glass of water or a moment's rest. Deceit could not be washed down with kindness. It would only curdle in the gut. So, before he could speak, before his gaze could soften with misplaced pity, she let the words spill out, a rush of confession she had rehearsed for 100 desolate miles. "I must tell you plain, Mr. Croft," she began, her voice rough like dry wood. "The advertisement asked for a woman of good character. I believe I am that. But there are things my letter did not say." Silas's expression did not change. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, remained fixed on her. He simply waited. "I am a widow, as I wrote, but I come with a child." She nudged Thomas forward slightly, a silent offering of the first truth. The boy shrank back behind her legs. Still, the man said nothing. His silence was a wall she had to keep throwing words at, hoping to see a crack. "And I come with this." Elara lifted a hand to her own face. With trembling fingers, she pushed back the heavy brown hair from her left temple, revealing the scar. It was a puckered, silvery line that ran from her hairline down to the sharp curve of her cheekbone. It was old, but it was ugly, a brand of misfortune. "I come with a scar and a child, sir." She let her hand fall, her breath held tight in her chest. She had laid her burdens on his welcome mat. The boy, a mouth to feed that was not his own. The scar, a mark of some past violence or tragedy that decent folk did not speak of. She had given him every reason to say no, every reason to close the door and leave her standing in the dust with her son and their one battered suitcase. She braced for the curt dismissal, the hard set of his jaw, the turning away. She was rejected for being too much and not enough, all at once. Silas Croft looked from her face to the small boy hiding behind her skirts. He looked at the scar she had revealed with such stark honesty. He saw the desperation in her eyes, but beneath it, a spine of solid steel. He saw a woman who chose a painful truth over a comfortable lie. He did not say no. Instead, he stepped back, pulling the heavy oak door inward. He opened the door wider. "The boy will need a glass of milk," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And you look tired, ma'am. Come inside." Elara felt the tension drain from her body in a dizzying rush. She took her son's hand, the small, sweaty fingers locking with hers, and stepped over the threshold. The house was large and cool, smelling of wood smoke and old sorrow. It was a man's house, clean to a fault, but lacking any softness. The floors were swept bare, the furniture was heavy and dark, and the air was still with a profound silence that spoke of loss. Silas watched her take it in. He saw her eyes catalogue the emptiness, the lack of a woman's touch. He had scrubbed the place himself, wanting it to be presentable, but he knew it was a hollow shell. His first wife, Mary, had filled this house with light and noise. Now it was just an echo chamber for his grief and the wild energy of his two sons. "My boys, Jacob and Daniel, are out with the stock," he said, breaking the silence. "They'll be back before supper." He did not add that he had not yet told them a woman was coming. He had not known how. He led her to the kitchen. It was the heart of the house, with a large iron stove and a long wooden table. He motioned for her to sit, then went to the icebox. Retrieving a pitcher of milk, he poured a cup for Thomas, his large, calloused hands surprisingly steady. Thomas, emboldened by the promise of milk, crept from behind his mother and took the cup. He drank it down in 3 long swallows, leaving a white mustache on his upper lip. Elara felt a wave of gratitude so sharp it almost brought her to tears. It was a simple act, a cup of milk for a thirsty child. But in her world, kindness had become a rare and precious commodity. "The arrangement stands, if you'll have it," Silas said, his back to her as he stood by the sink. "I need a mother for my sons. This ranch needs a woman's hand. In return, you and the boy will have a home. Food. Protection." It was a transaction. Nothing more. His tone was blunt, businesslike. He offered no sentiment, and she was grateful for it. Sentiment was a luxury she could not afford. "I will earn my keep, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice firm. "I am a hard worker. I will not be a burden." He turned then, and his eyes met hers across the room. "I do not expect you to be a servant, Elara." It was the first time he had used her name. "I expect you to be a partner. In running this house. In raising the boys." She nodded, accepting the terms. A partner, it was more than she had dared to hope for. Later that afternoon, the storm broke. 2 boys, aged 10 and 12, burst through the back door, bringing a whirlwind of dust and noise. They stopped dead when they saw Elara and Thomas sitting at their table. Jacob, the elder, had his father's dark hair and serious eyes. Daniel was fairer, with a face full of mischief that curdled into a scowl. "Who's she?" Jacob demanded, his gaze fixed on Silas, ignoring Elara completely. "This is Mistress Hale. And her son Thomas," Silas said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "She is going to be living here now. She will be running the house." He had not said, "your new mother." He knew that would be a battle fought and lost in the same breath, but the implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Daniel's eyes narrowed, flicking to the empty chair at the head of the table, the one that had been their mother's. He looked at Elara, his gaze openly hostile. "We don't need anyone." With that, he turned and stomped from the room. Jacob hesitated a moment longer, his dark eyes sweeping over Elara's worn dress, her tired face, and the small boy who looked about to cry. Then he, too, followed his brother. The silence they left behind was worse than the noise. Elara looked down at her hands folded in her lap. She had expected this. She knew she was an intruder in their grief, a replacement for a woman they had loved. She felt Silas's eyes on her. She looked up and saw not pity, but a kind of weary understanding. "They are protective of their mother's memory," he said quietly. "As they should be," Elara replied. "I am not here to replace her." He nodded, a flicker of respect in his gaze. He had wondered if he'd made a mistake. He'd wondered if any woman could handle the raw, angry grief of his sons. But looking at the quiet resolve in Elara's face, he felt a sliver of hope. She was not afraid. The first test came 2 days later. Elara had spent the time settling in, cleaning the small room she and Thomas would share, and slowly, cautiously, exploring the geography of her new life. The boys ignored her existence, speaking only to their father and moving past her as if she were a piece of furniture. She had unpacked their few belongings. Among them was Thomas's most prized possession, a small wooden horse, carved by his father. Its paint was worn. One ear was chipped, but Thomas slept with it every night. That afternoon the horse was missing. Thomas was inconsolable, his small body racked with silent sobs. Elara searched their room, the kitchen, the porch. It was gone, she knew, with a sinking certainty who was responsible. She found Jacob and Daniel by the creek, skipping stones across the water. She stood on the bank, not speaking, until Jacob finally turned. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone insolent. "Thomas's horse," she said simply. Her voice was calm without accusation. "He is very sad without it." Daniel snickered. "Probably lost it. He's just a baby." "He did not lose it," Elara said, her eyes meeting Jacob's. "It was on his bed. Now it is gone. Please give it back." Jacob held her gaze, a silent battle of wills. He was testing her. He wanted her to yell, to threaten, to run to his father. He wanted to prove she was weak, an interloper who would crumble. Elara did none of those things. She just waited, her hands clasped in front of her, her posture radiating a quiet, unyielding patience. Finally, with a frustrated sigh, Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out the little horse. He threw it on the ground at her feet. "Here," he muttered. "It's a stupid toy, anyway." Elara bent down and picked it up, brushing the dirt from its wooden flank. She did not scold him. She did not lecture him. Instead, she looked at him, and her expression was not one of anger, but of something else, something he could not name. "Thank you, Jacob," she said softly, and then she turned and walked back to the house. From the porch of the main house, Silas had watched the entire exchange. He had seen the boys go down to the creek, and he had seen Elara follow. His first instinct had been to stride down there, to grab his son by the collar and demand he show respect, but he had stopped himself. This was her battle. He needed to see how she would fight it, and she had fought it with a strength he had never seen before, a strength that was not in fists or loud words, but in stillness, in patience. She had not tried to punish or dominate. She had simply asked for what was right and had refused to be moved until she got it. He watched her walk back to the house, the small wooden horse held carefully in her hand. A wave of respect, profound and deep, washed over him. He had brought her here to be a mother to his sons. He was beginning to realize he had brought a queen into his keep. The days settled into a quiet rhythm. Elara rose before the sun, lighting the stove, her movements soft in the pre-dawn grey. The smell of coffee and frying bacon began to fill the house, a scent it had not known in a long time. She mended the boys' torn shirts, her stitches small and even. She baked bread, its warm, yeasty aroma, a comforting presence in the silent rooms. She did not push. She did not pry. She simply existed, a steady, quiet force of care. Silas found himself watching her. He would watch her from the barn door as she hung laundry, the sheets snapping white against the vast blue sky. He would watch her in the evenings as she read to Thomas by the firelight, her voice a low murmur. He noticed the way she moved, with an economy of motion that spoke of a life of hard work. He noticed the way her brow furrowed in concentration when she was kneading dough. He started leaving a small pail of the morning's richest milk on the kitchen step, telling himself it was for the boy. He chopped extra kindling and stacked it neatly by the stove, telling himself it was just a practical chore. One evening, a cold snap hit the plains. The wind howled through the eaves, rattling the window panes. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth. Thomas was asleep in their room. The older boys were supposed to be doing their lessons at the table, but Daniel was coughing, a dry hacking sound that had been getting worse all day. By nightfall he was burning with fever. Elara sent Jacob for cool water and cloths. She eased Daniel into his bed, speaking to him in a low, soothing voice. She bathed his face, her touch gentle on his hot skin. "Go to bed, father," Jacob said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "We can manage." But his eyes were wide with fear. He remembered the fever that had taken his mother. Silas looked at Elara. She was calm, competent. She moved with a purpose that eased the knot of panic in his own chest. He gave a short nod and retreated to his room, but he did not sleep. He sat in a chair by his window, watching the single light that burned in Daniel's room, and listened. Through the night he heard her soft footsteps, the murmur of her voice, the clink of a spoon against a cup. She did not rest. Towards dawn the coughing subsided. The house fell quiet. Silas went to the boy's room. The lamp was turned low. Elara was asleep in a chair beside the bed, her head slumped at an uncomfortable angle. One of her hands rested on Daniel's forehead. His fever had broken. He was sleeping peacefully, his breathing deep and even. A thick blanket was tucked around her shoulders. Silas looked at the foot of the bed and saw Jacob, curled up and fast asleep, having refused to leave his brother's side. He must have put the blanket on her. Silas stood in the doorway, a silent observer of the scene. This woman, this stranger, had fought a fever for his son. She had not done it for pay or for thanks. She had done it because it was what a mother did. In the quiet of that sick room, a wall around his own heart crumbled to dust. The next morning Daniel was weak but awake. Elara brought him a bowl of thin broth. He looked at her, his usual defiance gone, replaced by a weary vulnerability. "Thank you," he whispered. It was the first kind word either of the boys had spoken to her. From that day on, something shifted. The resistance in the house did not vanish, but it softened. Jacob began to speak to her, asking questions about the farm she had grown up on. Daniel started leaving her small, clumsy gifts on the kitchen table, a pretty stone from the creek, a bird's feather. They were peace offerings. One evening, as Elara was washing the supper dishes, Silas came to stand beside her. He picked up a towel and began to dry. They worked in silence for a long time, the only sounds the splash of water and the scrape of plates. "The scar," he said suddenly, his voice low. "You don't have to tell me, but He trailed off, unsure how to ask. Elara paused, her hands submerged in the warm, soapy water. She stared out the small window above the sink into the deepening twilight. "It was a fire," she said, her voice flat. "At our old cabin. I got Thomas out. My husband, he went back in for a lockbox of papers. The roof came down." She did not cry. Her words were simple, a statement of fact, but in them, Silas heard a universe of pain, of loss, of a terrifying bravery. The scar was not a mark of shame. It was a medal. He stopped drying the plate in his hand. He looked at her profile, the strong line of her jaw, the way the lamplight caught the silver track on her cheek. "My Mary," he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue after so long. It was a fever, like Daniel's, but it did not break. It was his own confession, a piece of his own pain offered in exchange for hers. Elara turned her head and looked at him. In her eyes he saw not pity, but a deep and profound empathy. She understood. She knew the shape of the hole that grief leaves in a life. In that moment, standing over a sink of dirty dishes, something new was forged between them. It was not love, not yet, but it was trust, a solid, quiet thing, a foundation on which something else might be built. The summer deepened, turning the prairies to a sea of gold. The ranch settled into a new kind of peace. The laughter of 3 boys now echoed in the yard. Elara's quiet presence had filled the empty spaces in the house, turning it from a shelter into a home. Silas found himself seeking her out, making excuses to be in the kitchen when she was there, just to be near the calm center of her. He told himself it was because the ranch was running more smoothly than it had in years. He was lying to himself. The truth was, he listened for the sound of her footsteps in the morning. The truth was, the sight of her reading to the boys by the fire was the best part of his day. The truth was, he was beginning to feel a sense of rightness when she was in the room, and a sense of lack when she was not. Then, the sky turned yellow. A strange, hazy smoke began to drift in from the east, carrying the scent of burning grass. A prairie fire, miles away, but the wind was blowing their way, hot and relentless. Panic was a spark in the air. Silas began shouting orders, getting Jacob to help him soak blankets and clear a firebreak around the house and barn. The day turned to a terrifying smoke-choked twilight. The sun was a dull red coin in the sky. "Elara, take the boys to the root cellar," Silas yelled, his face grim with soot. Now, she herded the 3 frightened children towards the heavy wooden doors set into the earth. Thomas was crying, and Daniel was trying to be brave, but his lower lip trembled. "Go with them," Silas commanded her. "No," she said, her voice steady despite the roar of the approaching flames. "I can help." He looked at her, ready to argue, but saw the resolve in her eyes. It was the same look she'd had at the creek. Unmovable. He nodded curtly. "Keep the sparks off the roof. Jacob, you're with me." The fire came like a roaring beast, a wall of orange and black that devoured everything in its path. The heat was a physical blow. Embers rained down like angry hornets. Elara, on the roof of the house with wet sacks, beat out the small fires as they started, her hair flying, her face a mask of fierce concentration. The main fire front passed them, a wave of destruction that mercifully skirted the main buildings. But the wind, fickle and cruel, shifted. A river of fire broke off, heading straight for the main barn where the winter feed and best livestock were sheltered. "The horses!" Silas roared, running towards the barn with Jacob at his heels. They managed to get the panicked animals out, but as Silas struggled with the last terrified stallion, A burning beam from the hayloft crashed down, pinning his leg. He cried out, a sharp sound of agony. Jacob screamed for his father. Elara saw it happen. She did not hesitate. No, she scrambled down from the roof, grabbing a heavy fence post on her way. She ran into the choking smoke of the barn, ignoring Jacob's terrified shouts for her to stay back. She saw Silas on the ground, struggling against the heavy, smoldering wood. The flames were licking closer. "Here," she yelled, shoving the fence post into his hands. "Use this for leverage, on my count." She wedged her own shoulder under the beam, gritting her teeth against the searing heat. The fabric of her sleeve began to smolder. 1, 2, 3. Together they heaved. The beam lifted just enough for Silas to drag his leg free. Elara helped him up, and they staggered out of the collapsing structure just as the roof caved in with a deafening roar. They fell to the scorched earth outside, coughing, gasping for air. Jacob and Daniel ran to them, crying with relief. Silas looked at Elara. Her face was black with soot, her dress was singed, and a raw, angry burn was blistering on her arm. She had run into a burning building for him, for his family. And in that moment, as he looked at her, the last of his carefully constructed walls turned to ash and blew away on the hot wind. It was not respect he felt. It was not admiration. It was a love so fierce and protective it stole his breath. He knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that this plain, scarred woman was the bravest person he had ever known, and her value to him, to his sons, to this land, was utterly irreplaceable. The fire passed. It left behind a blackened, smoking landscape, but the house and the family were safe. That night, the house was quiet. The boys, exhausted by fear and adrenaline, were fast asleep. Elara and Silas sat at the kitchen table. The air smelled of ash and salve. He had insisted on tending to the burn on her arm himself. His touch had been impossibly gentle as he cleaned the wound and wrapped it in clean linen. The intimacy of the act hung between them, a silent confession. Now he sat across from her, just looking at her in the soft lamplight. "This was meant to be an arrangement," he said, his voice quiet and rough. She looked up from her hands, her eyes meeting his. "It is not that any more," he continued, the words feeling clumsy but necessary. "Not for me." A long silence stretched between them. Elara's heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm. She had come here for shelter, for a chance at survival. She had not expected this. She had not dared to want it. "Nor for me," she whispered. He stood up and came around the table. He knelt before her chair, taking her uninjured hand in his. His thumb traced the calluses on her palm. "Elara," he said, her name a prayer. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It was gentle, warm, and full of a mutual recognition that stunned them both. It tasted of smoke and sorrow, and the surprising promise of a new beginning. It was a kiss that sealed the end of their arrangement and the start of everything else. Weeks later, a carriage pulled up to the ranch. A woman in a severe black dress and a judgmental expression stepped out. It was Agnes, Mary's older sister. She had heard of the fire and had come, she claimed, to see to the welfare of her nephews. Her eyes landed on Elara, who was on the porch mending one of Thomas's shirts, and her lip curled in disdain. Agnes filled the house with a cold, critical presence. She found fault with everything Elara did, her comments like small, sharp stones. She spoke constantly of Mary, of her beauty, her grace, turning her into a saintly memory that Elara could never hope to live up to. The boys grew sullen and withdrawn under her influence. The final confrontation came on a trip to town for supplies. They were in the general store, a hub of town gossip. Agnes saw her opportunity. "It must be so difficult for you, Silas," she said, her voice carrying through the store, "having to settle for this." She gestured towards Elara, who was examining a bolt of calico, a plain, scarred woman with another man's child. Mary must be turning in her grave. The store fell silent. All eyes turned to Elara. She froze, the fabric clutched in her hand, the heat of shame rising in her cheeks. The town gossips leaned in, eager for the drama. Elara felt the old familiar sting of rejection, of being judged and found wanting. She braced herself, expecting Silas to be embarrassed, to shush his sister-in-law, to handle it with his usual quiet stoicism. But Silas did not do that. He stepped forward, moving to stand directly beside Elara. He put his arm around her shoulders. A solid, public claim. He looked directly at Agnes, his eyes cold as steel. "You will not speak of her that way," he said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the silent store. He then turned to face the assembled townspeople. The stoic, reserved Silas Croft, who never spoke of his own heart, was about to give a speech. "You all look at this woman and see a scar," he began, his voice ringing with a passion no one had ever heard from him. He gently touched Elara's cheek, his fingers tracing the mark she had once thought defined her. "I see the mark of a hero. This scar was earned saving her child from a fire. The new burn on her arm," he gestured to her bandaged limb, "was earned saving me from one." A murmur went through the crowd. "You see another man's child," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "I see a boy that my own sons now call brother. You see a plain woman. I see the strongest, kindest, most courageous soul I have ever known. She brought my sons back from their grief. She turned my house back into a home. She faced down fire to protect us." He turned his gaze back to Elara, and his expression softened into one of pure, unadulterated love. "This woman is not something I have settled for," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She is everything I was not brave enough to hope for. I love her, and I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of her." He sealed his declaration by leaning down and kissing her, right there in the middle of the general store, in front of everyone. The silence was broken by one of the old ranchers at the back, who started to clap. Then another joined in, and another. The townspeople, swayed by his raw, heartfelt words, showed their approval. The looks they gave Elara were no longer filled with pity or suspicion, but with a newfound respect. Agnes stood, her face pale with fury and humiliation, utterly defeated. They rode back to the ranch in a comfortable silence. When they arrived, Silas led Elara not to the house, but to the skeletal remains of the burned barn. A few charred beams still stood, black against the evening sky. He stopped and took a small object from his pocket. It was a ring, carved from a piece of unburnt wood, salvaged from the fire. It was simple, imperfect, and the most beautiful thing Elara had ever seen. "I know this is all backward," he said, taking her hand, "but I need to ask it properly. Elara Hale, will you marry me? Not as an arrangement, but as my wife." Tears she had held back for years finally fell. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh yes, Silas." They were married a week later, standing on the porch where she had first laid her soul bare. Their only witnesses were 3 boys who stood beside them, no longer 2 sets of children, but one family. A year later, the land was healing. Patches of new green grass covered the black scars left by the fire. The ranch was thriving, filled with the sounds of hard work and easy laughter. Elara stood on the porch, a gentle swell to her belly, watching her sons, all 3 of them. They were teaching a new colt to accept a halter, Jacob's quiet patience balancing Daniel's eager energy, while Thomas offered the colt handfuls of grass. They moved together, a unit. Brothers. Silas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his hands on the curve of her stomach where their daughter Hope was growing. He pressed his cheek against her hair. She leaned back against his solid strength. She looked at the vast open prairie, at the house that was her home, at the boys who were her sons, and felt the man she loved holding her. She had come to this place with a scar and a child, offering up her broken pieces in exchange for shelter. And this man, this quiet, steady man, had looked at those pieces and seen not burdens, but treasures. He had taken them, and his own, and built a future more beautiful than either of them had ever dared to imagine. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. No words were needed. Their life was a testament, a quiet love story the whole county would indeed pass down for generations. The story of the woman who told a man every reason to say no, and the man who opened his door and his heart wider.